All right, the American Revolution was born of the Enlightenment, and we have talked about that with reference to John Locke and with reference to Thomas Jefferson, using Locke's ideas. Jefferson was a product of the Enlightenment. So America as a nation, the War for Independence, was born of the Enlightenment. We accepted the principle of freedom. We believe that individuals ought to have free choice, ought to have freedom within a country. We had people looking for a better life. They want to be controlled or dictated to by another. In the colonies, there was a strong middle class. In much of Europe, to this point in history, there was an aristocracy, people who had wealth, and then everybody else, people who were depending on the people who had wealth. In the colonies, it was different. While there were some wealthy people in the colonies, they were wealthy because they were merchants or they were traders. Everybody else could come in and really had the same opportunity as everybody else. You didn't walk in unless you were a slave. You didn't walk into the colonies behind the eight ball. You had an opportunity to get property. You had an opportunity to become a farmer. You had an opportunity to become a merchant or become a tradesman. So everybody had a chance to advance their own station in life, and that sense and desire for freedom was one of the things that frustrated the colonists with the idea of taxation without representation, which was the central cause or the aggravating cause that led to the War for Independence. I've already mentioned they owned land, which was not common for people in many of the European countries, particularly in England. Egalitarian feelings, it simply means there was a sense of equality between men and women, between men and men. There wasn't this sense of there are some people that are just born better than you, as has always been true in many European countries, particularly in Great Britain. How many of you girls watch Downton Abbey? You watch Downton Abbey? Any of you guys watch Downton Abbey?
Downtown Abbey?
Come on, guys, you know.
I may have referenced this before. You do? Yeah. Well, there's a sense, and it's a fantastically done show. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. My wife likes all things British drama, so I get to watch all that fascinating stuff. But the point is, if you watch any British drama, it doesn't matter what era, there's going to be people who are wealthy, and then people who serve the people that are wealthy. That's true, and that's part of the British culture. Well, that was different in the colonies. There wasn't this sense of somebody had power and somebody had wealth and somebody owned it, and everybody else served them. There was a sense of equality. Everybody started at the same place, and everybody could end at the same place, which was however far you could go, whether that be economically or whether that be personally and professionally. There was also the lack of a dominant church. Again, we've discussed how the church life, whether it be Protestant or whether it be Catholic, dominated much of Europe. That was not true of the colonies. And then there was a technical or scientific orientation that founded the colonies. In other words, people were inventive. They figured out how to do things because they had the opportunity and they had the necessity. And so you have those factors that kind of led into the period of the Revolutionary War. The specific causes for the revolution: there were economic problems in Great Britain, and economic problems in Great Britain do what to any leader? They have to raise income level. And there are 1,000 different philosophies about how to raise income governmentally. The most common and the most normal of all ages has been to raise taxes. But with the colonists, it was taxes without representation. They didn't have any say in how those taxes would be spent. There were political injustices. There were American protest reactions. The Boston Tea Party, that was a protest, pretty angry protest. But do you know the only casualties in the Boston Tea Party? The tea. Nobody beat anybody up. Nobody killed anybody. Just the tea. You had the Declaration of Independence, obviously, from Thomas Jefferson. First and Second Continental Congress, which is where representatives from the colonies met to discuss what to do about the taxation without representation. And there was significant debate for years in the colonies as to what the next step should be. Should it be declaring war? Should it be declaring independence? Should it be trying to take on the British Empire? Should it be trying to make peace? What was it? And it was a significant divide between many of the people within the colonies and leadership within the colonies. So it wasn't a foregone conclusion that war would be declared. You're going to read this in a minute, so we're not going to read it now. Winston Churchill, I love this quote because he's a Brit. We must never cease to proclaim in fearless tones the great principles of freedom and the rights of man, which are the joint inheritance of the English-speaking world, and which, through Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the habeas corpus, trial by jury, and the English common law, find their expression in the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, it's a good fat day.
What?
I said, that's a good fat day. What? Is he trying?
He was trying to speak British,
But it sounded
but
like
I have no idea what he just said.
it was like
He just left
nothing.
off like the last little bit of every single
The
word.
word.
See, I don't want anything British, okay, except everybody. That's it. That's it. Now, if I sit down,
I just find that it's fascinating that Winston Churchill would group all of those incredibly important historical documents and say they all find their expression in the Declaration of Independence. Interesting. I like Churchill
oh, yes.
as a political figure, as a character. He helped win World War II.
Amen.
This is another quote that you'll find interesting. It's from John Kennedy. He was hosting a dinner for Nobel Prize winners at the White House. He said, "This is perhaps the greatest collection of intellects ever to dine at the White House, with the exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined here alone." An attempt to give him significant intellectual credit. But as we've discovered, I mean, Jefferson borrowed from John Locke. Now, don't try to do what Jefferson did with a paper. That's called what?
Plagiarism.
What?
Plagiarism.
Plagiarism. Yes, Jefferson plagiarized Locke. That's a little different context and a little different situation. But anyway, so how did the Americans win? I mean, we were a bunch of colonies taking on the greatest empire on the face of the planet at the time. So how did the colonists win?
Guerrilla warfare.
Divine providence? Yes, it's not on here, but yes, that played a factor in it. Practically speaking, it's the methods of fighting. You had a few American successes with Trenton and Saratoga. The Swamp Fox. Y'all know who the Swamp Fox is? Francis Marion. Yeah, there's Francis Marion College in is it Marion, South Carolina?
South Carolina.
Yeah.
I live about 30 minutes from Marion.
Yeah. Fantastic character. If you guys watch the movie The Patriot. You've seen that movie, right? That is loosely built on a character like the Swamp Fox and the guerrilla warfare, or the Indian warfare, really, hiding behind trees and plucking British off. Because the warfare methodology at the time was to line up across from one another in a field, and I mean, there's a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage to do that, but that's not smart warfare. And so, early on, the Americans adopted, especially with some of the militias, they adopted a different approach, and they were able to have successes. Of course, the long supply lines were a factor for the British. What supplies they could gather in the colonies, they did, but to be fully supplied, they had to wait on ships to come all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. Eventually, the colonies had French support, which really led to the surrender of Yorktown, because you had Washington's army on one side, pinning Cornwallis against the bay, and then you had the French fleet on the other side. There was no retreat. A large area of engagement, New England to Georgia. I mean, think about this. The British had fought on the island of Great Britain, and sometimes in France, for 400 years previous history. And then you think about the difference in size and the difference in perspective that makes for, creating battle lines and making plans to fight. Eventually, the surrender of the best general, George Cornwallis at Yorktown, which I have already mentioned, and you had the diplomacy of John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. So ultimately, that's what happened to affect the victory of the colonies. This is Adams from David McCullough's book, biography on Adams. He said this, and I think it's helpful for us in this particular class. He said, "I must study politics and war, that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture, in order to give their children a right to study paintings, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain." Before I give you the point, what do you think his point is?
Don't forget where you come from.
Freedom's not free. There's a sacrifice that needs to take place for freedom.
Yeah, freedom's not free. You have to sacrifice. I will take issue with John Adams on one part. I don't think we ought to quit studying politics and war.
Could you just say history, maybe?
Do what?
Because I think of their own history, as far as, I guess that might be what he's trying to say. I'm not really sure.
Well, I mean, I think it is. I think we ought to study music and poetry and architecture and art. I think we ought to do that. I think that ought to be a part of our academic expression. I think the problem is, if that is the limit of our academic understanding, we're going to forget where we came from. We're going to forget how we got where we are, which is part of the problem in our. It's part of the problem today. I'm going to illustrate that with the assignment in the next part of class. Now, one of the issues with the American political process today, the cultural expression of American politics, is because we've forgotten the standards and the foundation principles by which, on which our country was founded. We established an enlightened government in the colonies. In a sense, there was a Roman model. Now, what I do want you to understand is that the Enlightenment thinkers, remember, the Renaissance was a rebirth of ancient classical works, whether that be scripture or whether that be Greek philosophy or Roman political theory. That was in the Renaissance. Well, the Renaissance and the Reformation era provided the content base for the Enlightenment thinkers to begin to develop differing ideas about politics and themes and ideas. I mean, Locke was familiar with Plato, and Locke was familiar with Roman politics, as were most of the Enlightenment thinkers, which would have played into men like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. They would have been well read in ancient models of politics and ancient models of philosophy, as well as biblical Christianity. And what you see in the colonies is this idea of taking some of the things that were beneficial from ancient political systems and putting them in place in the American system. The Roman model, for example, checks and balances. In the original Roman Republican model, you had what would amount to be an executive, as well as the Senate, which was made up of the aristocracy, and then you had the other. There was another area, and I can't remember the name of the segment, but that they were represented by the common people. And one of the things that our founding fathers did is they looked at the models and they said, okay, let's try to make this as best we can. And so they eventually established three branches of government: the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. They debated it, discussed it, and formally established the principles of liberty, or the Bill of Rights, which, by the way, you can thank Baptists for that. Did you know that? Baptists in Virginia were concerned about a particular, I think it was it's the Puritans essentially, but they were trying to institute formalized, standardized religion in Virginia. Trying to say, this is the way you worship, and this is the only way you worship. And Baptists in Virginia were concerned about that, and so they went to James Monroe and they went to others among who were represented in this first Congress when they were debating the issues. And they said, listen, we want to make sure that we have freedom of religion. And they were told, you have freedom of religion. That's going to be a part of our nation. And they said, well, we want to see it in writing. So you have the Bill of Rights, which we'll look at in a minute, in a few minutes. And one of the first articles in the Bill of Rights is that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion, of one's religious expression. And ultimately, the Baptists put their support behind James Monroe to be elected to the Congress. James Monroe, along with others, put together the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which formed the Bill of Rights. And they were put forward, and you can thank Baptists for putting pressure on the original Congress for making that happen. Alexis de Tocqueville, he wrote Democracy in America. Fascinating man, fascinating book actually. He came from France and from Europe to explore what made the American Revolution work, what made America so great. This is the early 1800s. And de Tocqueville visited the United States, and here's what he said: the laws that revolution stemmed from a desire for freedom, the freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the American attitude to get it done, and then an equal but different perspective with American men and women were part of the things that made America great. And here's some quotes from his work. I'll try to find the best one. This is a good one. The sovereignty of the people and the liberty of the press may therefore be regarded as correlative. In order to enjoy the inestimable benefits that the liberty of the press ensures, it is necessary to submit to the inevitable evils that it creates. It is an axiom of political science in that country, America, that the only way to neutralize the effect of the public journals is to multiply their number. What do you think de Tocqueville is saying? I realize it's early for some of you, but I want you to turn your brains on.
For people to get smart, education.
He did say that in other places. It's not technically what he's saying here about the number of journals.
As far as
you say
writing,
journals, it's newspapers.
as far as writings and what have you, the more you have, the more honest that it keeps each other.
Yeah. There's more freedom when there are more news outlets and news sources. If you think about it, in every totalitarian state, every one of them, in the last 250 years, one of the first things that the political leader did in any totalitarian state was nationalize the media. Every time. Why? Because if you control the news source, you control the information that gets out or doesn't get out. And one of the things de Tocqueville realized about the United States, and by the way, you think we have a political divide in our country today, right? Do you realize that we've had a political divide in our country since the 1780s? You realize that one of the most unethical, mud-smearing presidential campaigns happened in the late 1700s? It's not new. We see it differently today, but it's not new. What I would propose is that I like various news sources. I mean, I don't like that there are some news outlets that are predominantly liberal, and there are some out there that are predominantly liberal that don't like that there are news sources that are predominantly conservative. But what I don't like is there only seem to be about 6 of them. I wish there were 40 of them. Because you're exactly right. When you have a multitude of news sources, it keeps other news sources honest. In fact, the Internet's been a huge benefit to creating a sense of accountability to our news media. Because you don't have to go to ABC, NBC, Fox, MSNBC only to get news. You don't have to. You can, but you can find it in a lot of different places and a lot of different perspectives. That's healthy in a country. That's healthy. It's why I don't care where you stand politically. It's probably a good idea for you to listen to multiple news sources.
Except ABC and NBC and CBS.
Well, you can feel that way, Myron, but occasionally you ought to. You ought to see what they think. When I watch election coverage, I don't just watch one station. I flip back and forth because I want to see different perspectives. Why? Because I agree with all of them? No. Because I don't. And I find myself disagreeing with all of them at some level.
Mm-hmm.
But because the more information you get from different sources, the better you're able to think about it on your own. In other words, you don't become an automaton. You don't become a little robot.
I like Bill O'Reilly because the spin stops there. Does it?
Well, according to Bill O'Reilly, the spin stops there. But O'Reilly is a pundit. He's not purely a journalist. Well, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. If you realize that, it's like Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck. I like a lot of what Rush Limbaugh says, but he's an entertainer. Okay? His goal is entertainment. And he's making a lot of money. And by the way, he makes a lot more money when the Democrats in the White House than he does when Republicans in the White House. Because when the Democrats in the White House, he's pushing back and always able to have content. Same thing with Glenn Beck, same thing with others. Now, does that make them wrong or does that make them false in what they say a lot of times? Not necessarily. But what it does do, what I would encourage you to do is not just listen to one. If you're going to listen to one, great, but listen to a variety. And try to listen to people on opposite sides of the spectrum. Does that make sense?
One thing that I like that Fox does, and he brought up Bill O'Reilly, that O'Reilly does is he will have a debate between, leading liberals and conservatives, over.
O'Reilly's more fair than a lot of others that are in that same kind of genre. Because he's not purely a journalist. He's not just telling you what's going on in the news. He's commentating on what's going on in the news. And you have that you have that with Chris Matthews, and you have that with others on some of the other stations. O'Reilly is a little more fair, generally speaking. Fox News is a little more fair, generally speaking, I think. But they're not all right. And again, you shouldn't just get your news from one source. I wouldn't encourage that. But the Talkable's point is that that's one of the things that makes America great.
What was that quote? Men sacrifice for.
Yeah, we're not going to have time to deal with that, so we're going to skip it. All right, let's look at the French Revolution.
Okay. Did we need anything?
No. What you need, I'll give you at the end of this slide. There is a set of slides you write down. It's more contrast. French Revolution, guys, you're adults. Causes and attitudes of the French Revolution. The Enlightenment, there was a sense of an Anglophile feeling in France. The American Revolution. All that means is that there was kind of an inner motivation. They saw the success of the American Revolution, and they wanted to experience the same type of freedom that was experienced by the colonies. Okay? Now the causes it's fascinating actually. The French system's lack of change. When you had a sovereign, you had a king. Louis XVI clung to absolutism. We talked about that in previous weeks. The sense that the monarch had absolute control. He was a ruler. No one could question him. And he tried to lead that way. The king's response to the poor. He didn't take care of the poor, which they believed he should do. And when a king is living in the Palace of Versailles, eating prime rib and whatever other delicacies he wants, and spending hundreds of thousands of francs on his clothing, and you've got people in the streets starving to death. There's a huge divide between the haves and the have-nots, and not just the haves and have-nots in the sense of an elite group and a poor, but the monarch, the one who's responsible for the welfare of the country, and people are poor. And there was a significant divide going on in France in this era. Clay?
Was he the one that's, the French king that was, I think, 13 or 14 years old, or was that the one that?
I don't think so. I don't think he started it. I think that was one of his ancestors, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh.
And there was class resentment, which has been true in every culture, in every time, everywhere in the world. And I realize that's an overgeneralization, but poor people resent rich people resent poor people, the middle class resent both, in many senses. That's a general sense. But what happens is, when there is a huge divide between the haves and have-nots, class resentment can create constant problems. And every totalitarian state has used this to kind of springboard revolutions. Russians did it in 1917. The Germans did it with Nazism in the 1920s. It's a springboard. Class resentment's a springboard for something happening. And that's what happened with the French Revolution. Economic problems. Fascinatingly enough, the French helped the Americans, or the colonies, in the War for Independence. And that's part of the reason they had economic problems. They gave money to the colonies. We should be thankful to the French. It's one of the things that the French have done for the United States in the last 200 years. They gave us the financial resources, military resources to win the War for Independence. They didn't do so because they loved us. They did so because they hated England. But we should be thankful for that. But that created economic problems within the country. Myron?
Do you see the class resentment and, you know, the same kind of, almost kind of response to the poor as one of the reasons why our government is doing what they're doing, taking some of the steps that they're taking today?
I think there are some foundational things that are similar. I think there are some foundation pieces that are similar to this particular era, but I actually think it goes further than that politically, because there's a whole political history in our country following this era. So it's not exactly the same. There might be some foundation thoughts that are the same, but there's 200 years, 250 years nearly of political history following this that we're responding to and having to address. The king desired a new tax to stabilize the economy. That's what kings do when there's economic problems, a new tax. And so the Estates General came together. That was essentially their Congress. That would have been, but they hadn't met for 150 years. It was complete absolute rule, so the Congress wasn't necessary. So they needed to meet to address the issue of taxes, to address the issue of economic problems, to find out what to do about the king, how to help the king, how to work against the king. They initially met in 1789, and the Third Estate walked out. Now, here's why they couldn't agree. The First Estate was the aristocracy, the people that had. 1/3 of the Estates General was the people that had. The Second Estate was... No. The Second Estate was the clergy. Catholic clergy. Making up another third of the Estates General. So 2/3 of the Estates General was made up of the aristocracy and the clergy. Where do you think the clergy got what they got from? The haves. The aristocracy. The Third Estate was made up of everybody else, the have-nots. So it was an unequal representation among the people. Because you had, like, say, 80% of the people would fit the have-nots category, represented by 1/3 of the votes in Congress. Obviously, they couldn't agree. They couldn't agree, so the Third Estate walked out. No agreement whatsoever. The Third Estate left. They met in a separate place in an indoor tennis court, and they resolved to stay in session until a constitution could be written. The king couldn't get any money because he couldn't get the new tax approved. That stuff couldn't go through, so he instructed the First and Second Estates to meet with the National Assembly, which was the Third Estate, to come together and try to figure something out. Eventually, they formed a municipal government, which still didn't make people happy. And so on July 14, 1789, the municipal government was trying to get arms, and so they stormed the Bastille. and thus began the events of the French Revolution. Following this was when the Declaration of the Rights of Man was written down, which you're going to look at in a few minutes. You also had the secularization of the church and a new constitution. All this was done in the period of about 6 months to a year and a half. I mean, you had a complete shift of the French political process. And think about this. That's not, I mean, that you can do a lot in 6 months. The problem is that in the colonies, everything was new. Everything was new for the American colonies. In France, it's not just a shift in political theory or political process. It's a change of the way things have worked for 1,000 years. And so it's a far different change, and it had far more problems. Eventually, there was disillusionment of the lower class because what they proposed didn't work as they hoped. What they hoped is that the have-nots would have a chance to become the haves, or would at least have a better life. What actually happened is inflation. And when inflation happens, who gets hurt the worst? The poor. Eventually, they were drawn into war as well. And so the king and queen were ultimately arrested in the second stage of the Radical Revolution. And during that stage, which was 1793 to 1794, they instituted a committee for public safety. It was essentially a mob. France was losing war with others in Europe, and so they tried to institute these reforms. Tried to change to a metric system, a new calendar. By the way, the new calendar was 10-day weeks. They rejected the concept of 7 days and rest because the Enlightenment was a decidedly non-religious movement. And so, if you think about it, that's not surprising in France because the clergy was associated with who? The haves. The poor people didn't want to be associated with the clergy anymore or with religion anymore because religion had been a part of the controlling or dominating era of society. And so they rejected anything religious. It's why false religion and false theology is so dangerous. It's not just dangerous for the individual or the personal or the practical conversations. It's dangerous because of what it does as a false system. Because it pushes people away from the things of God and the things of the gospel rather than drawing to. They created universal freedom, or universal suffrage idea of whether the women could vote. That's not a bad thing. It was all lumped into a lot of other changes at one time. Same thing as eliminating slavery. They redistributed land and property. They defaced churches, and ultimately they killed 20,000 people by the guillotine in 2 years. King and queen as well. Anybody that they felt represented the controlling or the dominant or the oppressive side, they killed. Again, as I mentioned, I think in passing last week, you want to see a modern day depiction of the French Revolution, watch The Dark Knight Rises, and see what that looks like, and that's similar to what happened with the French Revolution. Obviously, they couldn't keep control of what was going on.